Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Every single letter you see, the curves of the B, the angles of the A, the simple line of the I, carries within it a 3,000-year-old secret. These shapes that seem so natural, so inevitable, were once revolutionary technology invented by a people whose very name has nearly vanished from common memory. The Phoenicians gave us the alphabet, yet left us almost no literature of their own. They built a commercial empire that spanned from Lebanon to Spain, from Cyprus to Morocco, yet never created a unified nation. They were everywhere and nowhere, invisible threads weaving the ancient world together. Tonight, we will sail with the purple merchants who transformed the Mediterranean from a barrier into a highway. We'll stand in the workshops where 1 pound of dye cost more than a year's wages for most people. We'll witness the moment when complex hieroglyphs and unwieldy cuneiform gave way to 22 simple marks that a child could learn, marks that would become the ancestors of nearly every alphabet on Earth. This is the story of a people who chose the sea over the land, trade over conquest, and influence over empire. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from in your local time. Feel time's current reversing, pulling you gently into the second millennium before the Common Era, into a narrow strip of land pressed between the Lebanon mountains and the wine-dark sea, where cedar forests touched the clouds and purple-fingered dawn revealed harbours that would change the world. Between the cedar and the sea, the geography that created the Phoenicians was both a prison and a liberation. Picture a coastline barely 20 miles wide at its broadest point, stretching 200 miles from north to south along the eastern Mediterranean. To the east, the Lebanon mountains rise like a wall, their peaks snow-capped even in summer, their slopes once thick with the famous cedars that would become synonymous with quality throughout the ancient world. To the west, the sea, endless, dangerous, full of promise. This wasn't a land that could support empire in the traditional sense. Unlike the vast river valleys of Egypt and Mesopotamia, where annual floods renewed the soil and irrigation could transform deserts into gardens, the Phoenician homeland offered limited agricultural potential. The coastal plain was fertile enough, blessed with reliable winter rains that would turn the hills green and fill the seasonal streams. But there simply wasn't enough of it. A growing population would quickly outstrip what the narrow valleys and terraced hillsides could produce. Yet this geographic constraint contained its own solution. The same mountains that hemmed them in also provided the finest shipbuilding timber in the ancient world. The cedars of Lebanon grew tall and straight, their wood naturally resistant to rot, their resin protecting against the marine parasites that devoured lesser vessels. The fir and pine of the lower slopes offered additional materials, while the rocky coastline created numerous natural harbours: Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Arvad, each one a potential gateway to anywhere the winds might blow. The Phoenicians' ancestors, the Canaanites, had lived in this land for millennia, part of the broader Semitic-speaking peoples who populated the Levant. But around 1200 BC, something changed. The great Bronze Age civilizations collapsed in a cascade of destruction that historians still struggle to fully explain. The Hittite Empire vanished. Mycenaean Greece descended into a dark age. Egypt barely survived waves of invasion by the mysterious sea peoples. In this chaos, the coastal Canaanite cities did something remarkable. They not only survived, but transformed themselves. The transformation wasn't immediate or planned. It grew from necessity, from the realization that when empires fell and trade routes collapsed, someone had to rebuild the connections. Someone had to carry the tin from Britain and the copper from Cyprus. Someone had to know where to find ivory and gold, incense and spices. The Phoenician cities, each independent but connected by language, culture, and kinship, became that someone. They looked at their narrow strip of land, then at the infinite horizon of the sea, and made their choice. The first voyagers. You stand on the deck of a ship that your grandfather would barely recognize as seaworthy. The year is perhaps 1100 BC, and you are about to do something that most consider madness. Sail beyond sight of land. The Lebanese coast vanishes behind you, swallowed by morning haze and distance. Your hands grip the steering oar, a new innovation that gives you control previous generations could only dream of. The ship beneath your feet is 50 feet of Lebanese cedar, its planks fitted edge to edge and sealed with bitumen, a technique your people pioneered. The sail above you, woven from Egyptian linen purchased with purple cloth, bellies out with wind that tastes of salt and possibility. You've heard the stories, of course. Ships that sailed west and never returned. Ships that found islands where God still walked among mortals. Ships that discovered harbours where the locals had never seen a sail, where a handful of copper tools could buy enough grain to feed a city. But stories are just wind until you live them yourself. The sun climbs higher, and you navigate by its path, by the flight of birds, by the colour of the water that changes from coastal green to deep blue to almost black. Your crew of 20 men, some related by blood, others by oath, work in practiced rhythm. They know 100 words for wind, 50 for different types of waves. They can smell rain 2 days before it arrives, can feel the presence of land beyond the horizon in the way swells change their pattern. As night approaches, the real navigation begins. The Phoenicians are among the first to sail by stars, to recognize that the heavens wheel in predictable patterns. You know the constellation the Greeks will call the Bear, but you have your own name for it, your own stories. More importantly, you know the small star that barely moves, the pole star that will guide you home. This knowledge is power, passed from father to son, guarded as carefully as the locations of the best purple shell beds, or the secret of mixing metals to make bronze. Cities of salt and gold. By 1000 BC, the Phoenician coast bloomed with cities that punched far above their geographic weight. Each operated as an independent city-state, ruled by kings who were as much merchant princes as monarchs, their power measured in ships and trade connections rather than territorial expansion. Byblos claimed the honour of being the oldest, its history stretching back 5,000 years. The Egyptians had been coming here for cedar since the age of the pyramids, and the city's very name would eventually become synonymous with books, the Greek word Byblos for papyrus, and eventually Bible, traced back to this ancient port. The harbour of Byblos was a crossroads where Egyptian gold met Mesopotamian silver, where Anatolian copper encountered Afghan lapis lazuli. The city's merchants pioneered the use of standardized weights and measures, creating trust in an age when every transaction required personal relationships. Sidon rose to prominence next. Its double harbours, one facing north, one south, allowing ships to dock regardless of wind direction. The Sidonians became famous above all for their glass, discovering techniques for making it clearer, stronger, more beautiful than anything produced before. But they also excelled in metalworking, their bronzes and silvers coveted across the Mediterranean. Homer would call them skilled in all manner of cunning handiwork, and archaeological evidence confirms their workshops produced everything from delicate jewellery to massive ceremonial cauldrons. But it was Tyre that would eventually eclipse them all. Built on a rocky island half a mile from the mainland, Tyre was virtually impregnable. Fresh water came from springs on the mainland, carried by boat, or later, through ingenious underwater pipes. The island's limited space forced the Tyrians to build upward. Some ancient sources describe buildings 6 stories tall, an ancient Manhattan rising from the waves. The city's purple dye workshops made it incomparably wealthy. its merchants so successful that neighboring rulers both courted and feared them. The relationship with Egypt proved especially crucial. As Egypt recovered from the Bronze Age collapse, it needed Lebanese cedar for temples, palaces, and ships. It needed Phoenician sailors who knew routes Egyptian captains had forgotten. A papyrus from around 1100 BC tells the story of Wenamun, an Egyptian priest who travelled to Byblos to buy cedar. The account reveals a transformed power dynamic. The prince of Byblos treats the Egyptian as a supplicant, not a representative of a superior power. He demands payment in advance, keeps Wenamun waiting, and lectures him on the mutual benefits of trade. The age of Egyptian dominance has ended. The age of Phoenician commerce has begun. The colour worth more than silver, the discovery that would define Phoenician wealth for a millennium, began with a dog, or so the legend claimed. The animal, walking along the beach near Tyre, bit into a shellfish and returned to its master with its mouth stained brilliant purple. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential: the transformation of the humble murex sea snail into the ancient world's most valuable commodity after gold. The science behind purple dye production was complex enough that modern chemists only fully understood it in the 20th century. The murex snails, primarily Murex trunculus and Murex brandaris, contained a tiny gland, the hypobranchial gland, that produced a clear liquid. When exposed to sunlight and air, this liquid underwent a remarkable transformation, turning first green, then blue, then finally achieving the deep purple that would clothe emperors and high priests. The process of extraction defied simple description in its laborious complexity. Each snail yielded just a few drops of the precious liquid. 12,000 snails might produce enough dye for the trim of a single garment. The shells had to be crushed at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the gland wouldn't have developed fully. Too late, and it would have depleted. The timing varied by season, by the snail's diet, by the temperature of the water where it lived. Archaeological sites along the Phoenician coast reveal the massive scale of this industry. At Sidon, at Tyre, at Sarepta, archaeologists have found literal mountains of crushed murex shells, some piles covering several acres and reaching depths of 40 feet. The smell must have been overwhelming. Ancient sources describe the purple dye workshops as the most malodorous places in the world. Rotting shellfish, fermented in vats for days, produced a stench that marked purple workers as clearly as the stains on their hands. Yet from this foul-smelling industry came cloth worth its weight in silver. The Phoenicians discovered that different species of murex, processed in different ways, could produce an entire spectrum of purples, from the deep purple-black favoured by Tyre to the brighter purple-red that Sidon specialised in. They learned to mix dyes from different species, to mordant the cloth so the colour would never fade, to achieve consistency across batches that should have been impossible given the natural variation in their source material. The most prized shade was Tyrian purple, also called royal purple or imperial purple. This wasn't just a colour, but a statement of power. In many ancient societies, laws restricted who could wear purple. In Rome, only the emperor could wear a toga entirely of Tyrian purple. The penalty for violation was death. The association between purple and power became so strong that it persists to this day. We still speak of being born to the purple to indicate royal birth. The economic impact transformed the Phoenician cities from modest ports to centres of incredible wealth. A single ship carrying purple cloth to Egypt or Greece might return with enough gold to build a temple. The dye industry created an entire economic ecosystem: divers to gather the snails, workers to process them, chemists to oversee the dyeing, merchants to sell the finished cloth, and shipbuilders to carry it across the sea. Breath of cedar, whisper of waves. The morning mist rises from the harbour of Tyre, like incense from an altar. The city awakens slowly. purple-stained workers emerging from their quarters near the dye works, their presence announced by scent long before sight. Merchants check their warehouses, running fingers over bolts of cloth that shimmer with colours that seem almost alive, purple so deep it appears black in shadow, then flashes with hidden crimsons when sunlight strikes it. Above the city, on the slopes of Lebanon, the cedar forests exhale their ancient breath. These trees have stood for centuries, some perhaps for millennia. Their wood contains memories of winter storms that bent but never broke them, of summer droughts that tested their deep roots, of the slow, patient accumulation of strength that makes their timber incomparable. When felled and shaped into ships, they carry something of that endurance with them, as if the tree's longevity passes into the vessels they become. The sea itself speaks in a dozen different voices. There's the gentle lapping against the harbour walls at dawn, rhythmic and hypnotic, the crash of waves against the offshore rocks during storms, powerful enough to shake the ground. The peculiar sound of water in the sea caves beneath the island, where smugglers and lovers meet in darkness. Each sound carries meaning for those who know how to listen. Warnings of weather changes, signals of seasonal fish migrations, messages from Yam, the old god of the sea, who existed before the Olympians were dreamed of. The merchant's dawn. Abmelkart wakes before sunrise, as his father did, as his sons will. His house in Sidon stands 3 stories tall, built around a central courtyard where a single olive tree provides shade and a reminder of the land his people largely left behind. His wife, already awake, has prepared the morning meal, flatbread warm from the oven, olives cured in the Phoenician manner with herbs from the mountains, cheese from the goats that graze the coastal hills, and wine mixed with water and honey. Today's voyage will take him to Cyprus, a journey of 3 days, if the winds cooperate. His ship waits in the harbour, already loaded with goods that represent a careful calculation of risk and reward. Purple cloth, of course, 3 bolts of the finest Sidonian purple, each worth a fortune, but also more practical items. Bronze tools forged by Sidonian smiths, glass vessels that catch and hold light like frozen water, cedar oil in ceramic jars, sealed with wax and marked with his personal seal. He reviews the manifest with his eldest son, teaching him the delicate art of commercial diplomacy. In Cyprus, they'll trade for copper, the essential ingredient for making bronze. But the real profit lies in what they'll learn, which mines are producing the purest ore, which local princes are rising or falling in power, where new markets might be opening. Information is as valuable as any cargo, and Phoenician merchants are the ancient world's primary information network. At the harbour, his crew of 15 men awaits. Some are cousins, others are men whose families have sailed with his for generations. Trust is everything on these voyages. These men will face storms together, fight off pirates if necessary, and guard each other's lives and fortunes. They share a complex system of profit sharing that ensures everyone benefits from successful voyages, motivation that makes Phoenician crews legendary for their dedication. As the sun rises, Abmelkart pours a libation of wine into the harbour waters, a prayer to Yam and Astarte for safe passage. His son watches, memorising the words he'll speak himself one day. Then they board, cast off, and begin rowing out of the harbour. Once clear of the breakwater, they'll raise the sail and let the wind gods take them. Another voyage begins, another link in the chain of commerce that connects the ancient world. Sacred groves and harbour gods. The religious life of the Phoenicians, interweaved with their maritime existence like rope fibres twisted for strength. Their gods were ancient, inherited from their Canaanite ancestors, but adapted to the needs of a seafaring people. Baal, the storm god, controlled the winds that filled sails or wrecked ships. Astarte, goddess of love and war, protected sailors far from home and blessed their return. Melkart, especially beloved in Tyre, was a dying and rising god whose annual resurrection coincided with the sailing season's start. The temples that dominated each city's skyline served multiple functions beyond the purely religious. They were banks, where merchants deposited wealth for safekeeping. They were archives where contracts were witnessed and stored. They were neutral ground where competitors could meet and negotiate. The Temple of Melkart in Tyre supposedly housed two pillars, one of gold and one of emerald, that shone with their own light. Whether real or metaphorical, these pillars represented the dual nature of Phoenician success, material wealth and divine favor inextricably linked. Religious ceremonies marked every significant maritime event. Before a new ship's launching, priests performed elaborate rituals, sacrificing animals and reading omens in their entrails. The ship itself would be consecrated, often with symbols of protective deities carved into its prow or stern. Many Phoenician ships carried small shrines, portable sacred spaces where sailors could make offerings during voyages. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks reveals these floating temples, miniature altars, incense burners, votive figurines, carefully stowed with the cargo. The Phoenicians practiced sacred prostitution in some temples, particularly those dedicated to Astarte. This practice, shocking to later Greek and Roman writers, formed part of a complex religious system linking fertility, commerce, and divine favor. Merchants visiting foreign ports would seek out local temples, making offerings that simultaneously honored the gods and established business relationships. Religion provided a common language of ritual and reciprocity that transcended linguistic and cultural barriers. The sacred groves of Lebanon held special significance. These ancient forests were more than timber reserves. They were living temples where some trees were considered too sacred to cut. The Phoenicians believed certain cedars were inhabited by divine spirits, their longevity evidence of divine blessing. Even practical merchants would detour miles to avoid disturbing these sacred groves, and treaties between cities sometimes included provisions protecting specific forests. This religious environmentalism, born from both reverence and self-interest, helped preserve the resources that made Phoenician prosperity possible. When Egypt called, the papyrus arrived in Byblos on a day when spring winds carried the scent of wildflowers down from the mountains. Prince Ahiram broke the seal himself, the cartouche of Ramesses III, a pharaoh struggling to hold Egypt together in the wake of the Sea People's invasions. The message was both plea and promise. Egypt needed ships, not just a few vessels for royal pleasure cruises on the Nile, but a proper fleet, warships and cargo vessels capable of re-establishing Egypt's disrupted trade networks. For Ahiram, this represented an opportunity that might come once in a generation. Egypt still commanded respect and resources, despite its current troubles. Egyptian gold was the purest in the known world, Egyptian linen the finest, Egyptian knowledge in mathematics, medicine, and engineering unmatched. But Egypt's shipbuilding industry had atrophied during centuries of Nile-focused prosperity. They needed Phoenician expertise. The prince assembled a team of his finest shipwrights, led by a master builder named Shipit-Baal, whose very name meant Baal has judged. Together with 20 skilled craftsmen, Shipit-Baal would travel to Egypt, to the port of Tanis in the Delta. Their mission? Establish a shipyard and train Egyptian workers in Phoenician techniques. In exchange, Byblos would receive payment in gold, guaranteed purchases of cedar at premium prices for 20 years, and, most valuably, preferred trading status in Egyptian ports. The collaboration proved more complex than anyone anticipated. Egyptian officials, proud inheritors of 3,000 years of civilization, bristled at taking instruction from foreigners. The Phoenician shipbuilders, accustomed to the independent decision-making of their city-states, struggled with Egyptian bureaucracy, where every design change required approval from multiple officials. Yet gradually, mutual respect emerged. The Egyptians marveled at Phoenician innovations, the mortise and tenon joining that created stronger hulls, the rope truss systems that prevented ships from breaking apart in heavy seas, the balanced sail plans that allowed vessels to sail closer to the wind. Within 3 years, the shipyard at Tanis was producing vessels that combined the best of both traditions. Egyptian decorative arts graced Phoenician hull designs. Phoenician sailing techniques were recorded in hieroglyphic manuals. Some of the workers, both Egyptian and Phoenician, intermarried, creating families that would carry both traditions forward. When Shipwrecks finally returned to Byblos, he brought with him not just gold but knowledge, Egyptian techniques for preserving wood, new methods for calculating cargo capacity, and navigation records for Red Sea routes the Phoenicians had never sailed. Ships like cities, cities like ships. The Phoenician shipyards of the 9th century BC were theatres of controlled chaos where the future took shape in cedar and bronze. At Tyre's naval workshops, master shipbuilders commanded teams of specialists whose combined knowledge represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Here, the Phoenicians didn't just build ships, they engineered floating cities capable of surviving months at sea, vessels that redefined what humanity thought possible on water. The revolution began with the hull, where other Mediterranean peoples still used sewn plank construction, literally stitching planks together with rope. The Phoenicians perfected mortise and tenon joinery. Each plank was fitted with projecting tenons that slotted into precisely cut mortises in the adjoining plank, then locked in place with wooden pegs. The result was a hull that functioned as a single unit, flexing with waves rather than fighting them. These ships could carry loads that would have broken apart vessels of traditional construction. Consider the dimensions that archaeological evidence and ancient texts reveal. The standard Phoenician merchant vessel, what they called a gorlos, measured between 60 and 90 feet in length, with a beam of 20 to 25 feet. But the pride of their fleet, the massive merchantmen, known as ships of Tarshish, stretched to 120 feet or more. These vessels could carry 500 tons of cargo, equivalent to the load of 1,000 pack animals. One ship could transport enough grain to feed a city for a month, enough copper to equip an army, enough purple cloth to drape a palace. The innovation extended beyond mere size. Phoenician ships featured multiple decks, with cargo holds below, living quarters and workshops on the middle deck, and navigation spaces above. They incorporated revolutionary ballast systems using carefully calculated loads of stones or sand that could be adjusted to compensate for cargo distribution. The ships even included built-in pumping systems, bronze pipes, and leather valves that allowed crews to remove water from the bilge without buckets and human chains. The sailing technology proved equally advanced. While contemporary vessels relied on a single square sail that only functioned with following winds, Phoenician ships employed multiple sail configurations. They used a large square mainsail for open ocean sailing, but also carried a forward raked sail, called an artemon, that improved maneuverability and allowed sailing closer to the wind. Some vessels even featured topsails, an innovation that wouldn't become common in European shipping for another 2,000 years. Navigation equipment went far beyond basic tools. Phoenician ships carried sounding weights, lead weights on marked lines for measuring depth, often hollow at the bottom, and filled with wax or tallow to bring up samples of the seafloor. They had primitive compasses using lodestones floating in oil. They possessed detailed written sailing instructions, called periploi, that described coastlines, harbours, hazards, and seasonal wind patterns. These documents, guarded as state secrets, contained information gathered over centuries of exploration. The ships served as mobile workshops and factories. Archaeological evidence from a shipwreck off the coast of Turkey revealed that Phoenician vessels carried portable forges for metalworking, looms for textile production, and even equipment for producing purple dye. This allowed them to process raw materials during voyages, arriving in port with finished goods rather than crude resources. A ship that left Tyre with copper ingots and raw wool might arrive in Carthage with bronze tools and purple cloth. The human engineering matched the technical innovation. Phoenician ships operated with smaller crews than comparable vessels of other nations, typically 15 to 25 men for a merchant ship, compared to 40 or more for Greek vessels of similar size. This efficiency came from superior design that required less rowing in harbour, better sail handling systems, and crews trained from childhood in seamanship. Every sailor was expected to master multiple roles: navigation, sail handling, cargo management, and basic ship repair. The infinite horizon. You stand at the helm as dawn breaks over waters no Phoenician has sailed before. 3 months out from Gadea, the settlement at the edge of the world, you've passed through the Pillars of Heracles and turned south along the African coast. The constellation you've always used to navigate, the Bear, has sunk so low on the horizon that some nights you can barely see it. You're navigating by new stars now, strange southern lights that your grandfather never saw. The ocean here behaves differently than the Mediterranean, you know. The swells are longer, deeper, born from storms thousands of miles away. The colour is different too. Not the wine-dark sea of home, but something greener, more alive. Your crew has started catching fish that no one can name, with scales that flash colours you've never seen. Yesterday, creatures longer than your ship surfaced nearby, breathing fountains of mist into the air before disappearing into the depths. Your water supplies are holding, thanks to the ceramic jars sealed with pine resin that keep the contents fresh for months. But fresh food is running low, and you need to find land soon. You've been following the coast, but keeping far enough offshore to avoid reefs and shoals. The sounding weight tells you the water is getting shallower, 40 fathoms, 30, 20. Land must be near. Then you smell it before you see it. Smoke, but not the wood smoke of home. This has an earthier scent, mixed with something floral. As the sun climbs higher, the coast materializes from the morning haze, a river mouth, wide and brown with silt. And there, movement on the shore. People, but not like any you've encountered. Their skin is dark as polished ebony, their hair arranged in patterns you've never imagined. They're watching your ship with the same mixture of fear and fascination that you're feeling. You order the anchor, dropped just outside the breakers. This is the moment that will determine everything. You select your gifts carefully. Bronze mirrors that capture sunlight, small glass vessels filled with perfumed oil, a bolt of cloth dyed the deepest purple. You take only 3 men with you in the small boat, leaving weapons behind. As you wade through the surf onto this unnamed shore, you're aware that you're writing history. No maps exist of this place. No sailing instructions will guide you. You're creating the knowledge that your sons and their sons will inherit. The locals approach cautiously. You spread your gifts on the sand and step back. One of them, braver or more curious than the rest, picks up a mirror. When he sees his reflection, his expression transforms from suspicion to wonder. He laughs. And laughter, you've learned, sounds the same in every language. By sunset, you're trading. By the next full moon, you'll have established a permanent trading post. This is how empires are built, not with swords, but with mirrors and purple cloth and the courage to sail beyond the edge of the known world. Markets at the edge of the world. By the 8th century BC, Phoenician trading posts dotted coastlines from Cornwall to Senegal, from the Black Sea to possibly even India. These weren't colonies in the traditional sense, no armies of occupation, no imposed governments. Instead, they were nodes in a commercial network that operated more like a modern multinational corporation than an ancient empire. In Britain, Phoenician traders established contacts with the tin miners of Cornwall. Tin was essential for making bronze, and the British sources were among the richest in the known world. The journey there required sailing through the dangerous waters of the Bay of Biscay, navigating by stars often hidden by northern clouds, and dealing with tribes who had never seen Mediterranean goods. The Phoenicians succeeded where others feared to venture, exchanging Mediterranean wine, oil, and manufactured goods for tin that would be alloyed with Cypriot copper in Phoenician workshops. The Iberian Peninsula proved even more valuable. At the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, they encountered the kingdom of Tartessos, fabulously wealthy from silver mines in the Rio Tinto region. The Phoenicians established Gadir, modern Cadiz, around 1100 BC, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. From Gadir, they could access not just Spanish silver, but also African gold, ivory, and exotic animals for Middle Eastern royal menageries. The African expeditions pushed even further. Phoenician explorers sailed down the Moroccan coast, establishing Lixus near modern La Rochelle, then continuing south. They founded trading posts on small islands off the coast, Mogador, perhaps even further south. Ancient accounts, particularly Herodotus, describe a Phoenician expedition commissioned by Pharaoh Necho II around 600 BC that supposedly circumnavigated Africa, sailing down the Red Sea and returning through the Pillars of Heracles. While historians debate this claim, the details Herodotus preserves that the sun appeared on their right side while sailing westward around the southern cape suggests authentic observation of southern hemisphere phenomena. In the other direction, Phoenician traders penetrated deep into the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence of Phoenician artifacts in India and Sri Lanka, combined with linguistic traces and ancient texts, suggests regular trade contact. They sought spices, precious stones, and possibly even silk from early Chinese merchants. The logistics of these expeditions boggle the mind. Journeys of thousands of miles, taking years to complete, requiring cooperation with dozens of different peoples, and navigation through waters where monsoons could destroy fleets. Each market required its own approach. In sophisticated kingdoms, Phoenician traders operated through official channels, negotiating with royal officials and paying customs duties. In tribal territories, they employed gift diplomacy, offering prestigious items to chiefs in exchange for trading privileges. In uninhabited regions, they practiced silent trade, leaving goods on a beach, withdrawing, and allowing locals to leave their own goods in exchange, all without direct contact. 22 marks that changed everything. The greatest Phoenician invention wasn't a physical object, but an idea so powerful it would transform human civilization: the alphabet. Around 1000 BC, in the bustling ports of Phoenicia, someone, or more likely, many someones over time, accomplished the most radical simplification in the history of writing. They reduced the thousands of symbols used in hieroglyphic and cuneiform writing to just 22 letters. To understand the revolution, consider what came before. Egyptian hieroglyphics included over 700 common symbols, with thousands more for specific religious and royal contexts. Learning to read and write required years of specialized education, creating a scribal class that monopolized literacy. Mesopotamian cuneiform was somewhat simpler, but still demanded mastery of 600 or more signs. In both systems, most symbols represented entire words or syllables, and the same symbol might have multiple meanings depending on context. The Phoenician breakthrough was breathtaking in its simplicity. Every sound in their language could be represented by combining just 22 consonant symbols. No vowels, context, and familiarity filled those in. The letter B always represented the same sound, whether it appeared in Baal or Byblos or bronze. This consistency meant that anyone who learned the 22 symbols could theoretically read any word, even unfamiliar ones. The shapes themselves derived from common objects: making them easier to remember. Aleph, the first letter, meant ox and looked like an abstracted ox head. Beth meant house and resembled a floor plan. Gimel meant camel and suggested the animal's humped profile. This mnemonic system meant that merchants could teach the alphabet to their sons during a single sea voyage, rather than requiring years of formal education. The economic advantages were immediate and overwhelming. Contracts could be written clearly and unambiguously. Inventories could be tracked precisely. Letters could be sent between ports, carrying information faster than ships could carry goods. A merchant in Tyre could send detailed instructions to his agent in Carthage, confident that the message would be understood exactly as intended. The democratization of literacy meant that ordinary traders, not just elite scribes, could maintain records and correspondence. The alphabet spread like wildfire because it solved problems everywhere it went. The Greeks encountered it through trade contact, probably in the 8th century BC. They adapted it to their own language, adding symbols for vowels, creating the ancestor of the Latin alphabet you're reading right now. The Arameans modified it for their Semitic tongue, and their version became the ancestor of Arabic and Hebrew scripts. The Etruscans learned it from the Greeks and passed it to the Romans. Within 5 centuries of its invention, alphabetic writing had largely replaced older systems throughout the Mediterranean world. But the Phoenicians themselves left frustratingly little literature. We have thousands of short inscriptions, dedications, epitaphs, commercial documents, but no Phoenician Iliad, no Epic of Gilgamesh. Perhaps their literature was written on papyrus and perished. Perhaps their culture valued commercial innovation over literary preservation. Or perhaps, in the ultimate irony, the people who gave the world the tools for literature were too busy using those tools for trade to create lasting literary monuments. The few longer texts we have offer tantalizing glimpses. The sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos bears an inscription cursing anyone who disturbs his rest, the oldest known alphabetic inscription of substantial length. Religious texts found at Ugarit preserve Canaanite myths that probably reflect Phoenician beliefs, but mostly, we're left reading about the Phoenicians in languages they made possible, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, rather than hearing their own voices directly. Songs of Astarte, the temple fills with smoke from frankincense and myrrh, precious resins from Arabia that only the wealthiest cities can afford to burn in such quantities. The smoke doesn't rise straight, but seems to writhe and dance, as if animated by the goddess herself. Through the haze, bronze mirrors catch and scatter lamplight into fragments that flutter like golden butterflies across the walls. The priestesses move in patterns older than memory, their bare feet silent on stones worn smooth by centuries of ritual dance. Their robes are purple, naturally, not the dark purple of Tyre, but the lighter, more violet shade that Sidon produces. The colour of the sky just after sunset. Gold threads run through the fabric, catching light with each movement, creating the illusion that the dancers are wrapped in twilight itself. Musicians accompany them with instruments that speak in voices both familiar and strange. The frame drums beat like hearts, like waves against stone, like the rhythm that underlies all life. Bone flutes wail with notes that seem to come from beyond the human world. Melodies that pull at something deep in the belly, something that remembers when humans first learned to make music. The sistrum rattles with its metal discs, a sound like coins falling, like rain on leaves, like the goddess laughing at mortal pretensions. Incense burners, shaped like ships, swing from chains, trailing scented smoke that makes thoughts drift and boundaries blur. This is the hour when Astarte is closest, when the veil between divine and mortal grows gossamer thin. The worshippers sway, caught in rhythms that bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to older parts of the brain, parts that remember when gods walked openly among humans. The scribe's revolution. Hanno had spent 30 years, as a traditional scribe, master of Akkadian cuneiform with its 600 wedge-shaped marks. His fingers bore the permanent stains of a lifetime of pressing reed styluses into clay tablets, recording the endless commercial transactions of Byblos. He took pride in his expertise, in being one of perhaps 24 men in the city who could read and write fluently. Then, in the span of a single summer, everything changed. The merchant Ahimelech had returned from Tyre with something new, a piece of papyrus covered with strange marks. 22 symbols, he announced to anyone who would listen. That's all. My 12-year-old son learned them in 10 days. He can now write anything he can say. Hanno's first reaction was dismissal. How could 22 symbols possibly capture the complexity of language? Where were the determinatives that indicated whether a symbol meant a god, a city, or a concept? Where were the syllabic combinations that had taken him years to memorize? This wasn't writing. It was crude mark-making, suitable perhaps for simple lists but nothing more. But Ahimelech persisted. He offered Hanno a proposition. Learn this new system and teach it to others. The payment he offered was generous, suspiciously so. Against his better judgment, Hanno agreed to examine these letters, as Ahimelech called them. The first lesson shattered his preconceptions. Aleph, Beth, Gimel, ox, house, camel, simple pictures abstracted to essential strokes. Each symbol represented not a word or syllable, but a single sound. By combining them, any word could be written. The system was so logical, so elegant, that Hanno found himself grasping principles in hours that had taken him months to understand in cuneiform. Within 3 days, he could write simple sentences. Within a week, complex ideas. Within a month, he was writing faster in this alphabet than he had ever written in cuneiform. More remarkably, he found he could read texts from Sidon and Tyre without difficulty, despite dialect differences that would have required completely different symbol sets in traditional writing. The implications terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. If anyone could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks rather than years, what happened to scribes? But also, what possibilities opened up? Hanno began teaching, first reluctantly, then with growing enthusiasm. His students included not just merchants' sons, but sailors, craftsmen, even a few women who managed household estates. Each new literate person became a node in an expanding network of written communication. By year's end, Hanno had trained 40 new readers and writers. The harbour district buzzed with papyrus messages, wooden boards covered with alphabetic graffiti, even love letters, a concept that would have been impossible when literacy was restricted to professional scribes. Hanno himself found new employment, not as a scribe, but as a teacher, his income tripling as demand for alphabetic literacy exploded. The revolution he had feared would destroy him had instead transformed him into one of its primary beneficiaries. Purple fingers, golden futures. In the dye workshops of Tyre, dawn arrives twice. First comes the natural sunrise, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Then comes the second dawn, as the workshop fires are lit, their light filtered through purple-stained glass windows, casting an otherworldly glow that transforms everything it touches. The workers' hands tell stories that no amount of washing can erase. The purple has worked its way into the holes of their fingerprints, under their nails, into the creases of their palms. These stains mark them as members of an exclusive guild, practitioners of mysteries that generate more wealth than gold mines. Children born to purple workers often emerge with a faint violet tinge to their skin, as if the dye has entered their very bloodlines. The smell is overwhelming at first, decay and sea salt, chemistry and transformation. But after weeks, months, years, it becomes background, no more noticeable than breathing. The workers move through clouds of purple steam rising from the vats, their faces obscured, appearing and disappearing like spirits. They speak in technical terms outsiders wouldn't understand, discussions of reduction and oxidation, of temperature controls that must be precise to the degree of timing measured, not in hours, but in the subtle colour changes that only trained eyes can detect. Yet for all the smell and stain, these workers are aristocrats of labour. A master dyer earns more than most merchants. Their children receive education. Their widows are provided for by the guild. They know their work, clothes emperors and high priests, that purple threads from their vats will be woven into the very fabric of power across the known world. Westward, always westward. The Phoenician expansion westward wasn't an empire in the traditional sense, but something more like a vast commercial franchise system. Each new settlement began the same way, scouts identifying a promising harbour, preferably on an island or peninsula for defence. Then came the negotiators, bearing gifts for local chiefs, arranging treaties that typically granted the Phoenicians a small coastal enclave in exchange for annual payments and guaranteed trade. The pattern repeated from Cyprus to Sicily, from Sardinia to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Each settlement maintained loyalty to its mother city. Colonies of Tyre answered to Tyre, those of Sidon to Sidon, but operated with considerable autonomy. They were expected to be self-sufficient within a generation and profitable within two. The successful ones became mother cities themselves, spawning their own colonies in an ever-expanding network. Sicily became particularly crucial, positioned perfectly between the eastern and western Mediterranean. The Phoenicians established Motia on a small island off the western coast, building a causeway to the mainland that could be destroyed in case of attack. The city became a hub for trade with the Greeks, who were simultaneously colonizing eastern Sicily, creating a dynamic and sometimes tense marketplace of competing cultures. Sardinia offered different opportunities. The island's interior remained controlled by the indigenous Nuragic civilization with their mysterious stone towers, but the Phoenicians established coastal settlements at Nora, Tharos, and Sulci. From these bases, they accessed Sardinia's mineral wealth, silver, lead, and iron, while also using the island as a stepping stone for voyages to Iberia and beyond. Malta, tiny but strategically located, became almost entirely Phoenician in character. The island served as a crucial way station and repair facility for ships crossing the central Mediterranean. The Phoenicians introduced sophisticated irrigation systems that transformed Malta's agriculture, techniques still visible in the island's terraced fields today. But the greatest success story was unfolding on the North African coast. Here, in modern Tunisia, the Phoenicians would create something unprecedented, a colony that would surpass its mother city, an offspring that would carry Phoenician culture to heights the homeland never achieved. That city was Carthage, and its founding around 814 BC would change the course of Mediterranean history. New Carthage rising. The story of Carthage's founding blends history and myth in ways that make the truth impossible to fully recover. The most famous version involves Elissa, also called Dido, a Tyrian princess, fleeing political persecution after her brother, King Pygmalion, murdered her husband for his wealth. With a fleet of ships carrying Tyrian nobles and sacred temple objects, she sailed west, seeking a place beyond her brother's reach. The historical kernel within the legend seems solid. Carthage was indeed founded by Tyrian colonists around 814 BC, during a period of political instability in the homeland. The colonists chose their location with the brilliant strategic insight that characterized Phoenician expansion. The site commanded a peninsula with excellent harbors on the narrowest part of the Mediterranean, where Sicily is visible on clear days. Any ship travelling between the eastern and western Mediterranean would pass within sight of Carthage. The founding myths preserve memory of careful diplomacy with local populations. The famous story of Elissa, negotiating for as much land as an ox hide could cover, then cutting the hide into thin strips to encircle an entire hill, might reflect actual, clever negotiations. The Phoenicians needed local cooperation for food, for labour, for knowledge of regional conditions. The indigenous Libyan peoples needed access to Phoenician trade networks and manufactured goods. The relationship, while not always smooth, proved mutually beneficial enough to endure. Archaeological evidence reveals how quickly Carthage grew from trading post to major city. Within a century of its founding, the city had expanded far beyond its original boundaries. The Phoenicians brought urban planning expertise from their homeland, but adapted it to local conditions. They built sophisticated water storage systems to survive the North African dry season. They constructed artificial harbours, the famous Kothon, with ship sheds that could shelter 200 vessels. They laid out streets in a grid pattern that would be copied by later Roman city planners. Carthage innovated politically as well as physically. While maintaining ceremonial ties to Tyre, the city developed its own system of government that balanced monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. 2 judges, called suffes, similar to Roman consuls, held executive power. A council of elders provided aristocratic oversight. A popular assembly had the final say on major decisions. This system, praised by Aristotle as one of the best designed constitutions in the ancient world, provided stability that allowed Carthage to prosper for 6 centuries. The economic foundation combined traditional Phoenician enterprises with new opportunities. Purple dye production continued, using murex snails from North African waters. But Carthage also developed massive agricultural estates in its hinterland, introducing advanced farming techniques that made North Africa a breadbasket. Carthaginian agricultural manuals would later be translated into Latin and Greek, spreading Phoenician farming knowledge throughout the Mediterranean. The city's workshops produced goods on an almost industrial scale. Carthaginian pottery, jewellery, and metalwork found markets from Britain to Egypt. But perhaps most importantly, Carthage became a centre of shipbuilding innovation. The Carthaginians developed the quinquereme, a warship with 5 banks of oars that would dominate naval warfare until the advent of gunpowder. They pioneered the use of bronze rams below the waterline, turning ships themselves into weapons. The captain's gamble: your hands shake slightly as you give the order to turn west, away from the African coast and into the open Atlantic. Your Hanno, called the navigator, admiral of a Carthaginian fleet of 60 ships carrying 30,000 colonists. The year is roughly 500 BC, and you're attempting something that most consider impossible: to establish permanent Phoenician settlements down the western coast of Africa. Behind you, the pillars of Heracles shrink until they're just bumps on the horizon, then disappear entirely. You've sailed beyond them before, but never with such responsibility. These aren't exploratory vessels crewed by adventurers. These are families, men, women, children, trusting you to find them new homes in lands that exist only as rumours and traders' tales. The Atlantic's swells lift your ship higher than anything the Mediterranean produces. Your flagship, a massive Gorlos modified for ocean travel, groans with each wave but holds strong. Tyrian cedar, properly maintained, can last a century, and this ship is only 5 years old. Still, you find yourself listening to every creak, every stress sound the wood makes. 5 days out, you encounter the Canary Current, a river within the ocean that pulls you southward with unexpected force. You could fight it, order the rowers to work against it, but you recognize it for what it is: a gift from Melkart, a pathway to wherever you're meant to go. You let the current take you, adjusting your sails to work with it rather than against it. The first landing comes after 2 weeks, a river mouth the locals call Lixus. Here, you establish your first colony, leaving 500 families with supplies, seeds, and hope. The indigenous Berbers watch from the hills, curious but not hostile. You conduct the rituals of foundation, sacrificing to the gods, marking out the boundaries of the settlement, planting the sacred grove that will become the heart of the new city. Then southward again, following the coast but staying far enough out to avoid the treacherous shore breaks that can destroy a ship in seconds. You establish settlements at regular intervals: Thymiatarian, Cerne, Melita. At each stop, the world grows stranger. The trees change from familiar Mediterranean species to things you have no names for. The animals too, creatures with necks as long as ship masts, others with hides like armour, birds with beaks shaped like boats. At a place you'll call Cerne Island, you encounter people who trade in complete silence. They lay gold dust on the beach and retreat. You place trade goods, purple cloth, bronze tools, glass beads, and withdraw in turn. They return, examine your offerings, and either take them, leaving the gold, or depart, taking their gold back. No words are exchanged, no faces seen clearly, yet commerce flows as smoothly as in any Carthaginian market. Children of two worlds. Imilce was born in New Carthage in Iberia, daughter of a Phoenician merchant father and an Iberian priestess mother. At 16, she embodied the fusion that was creating something new in the Western Mediterranean, neither purely Phoenician nor purely indigenous, but a blend that drew strength from both traditions. She spoke 3 languages fluently: the Punic dialect of Carthaginian Phoenician, the Iberian tongue of her mother's people, and the Celtic-influenced trade language of the interior tribes. Her education combined Phoenician literacy and mathematics with Iberian knowledge of local plants, animals, and seasonal patterns. She could calculate interest on a loan or identify which local herbs would cure fever with equal facility. Her marriage negotiations illustrated the complex dynamics of colonial society. 3 suitors competed for her hand: a pure-blood Carthaginian merchant who offered connections to the North African trade networks, an Iberian noble who controlled silver mines in the interior, and another mixed-heritage youth whose family had pioneered new agricultural techniques, combining Phoenician irrigation with indigenous crops. The choice fell to Imilce herself, a freedom that would have been impossible in traditional Phoenician or Iberian society, but had become accepted in the colonial melting pot. She chose the mixed-heritage suitor, not for wealth or connections, but because she saw in him the same hybrid vigour that she felt in herself. Their wedding celebrated both traditions: Phoenician purple cloth and Iberian talks, prayers to both Tanit and the Iberian goddess Atesina. Their children would grow up even more culturally fluid, adding Greek and Roman influences as those powers expanded into Iberia. This cultural blending, repeated across hundreds of Phoenician settlements, created resilient communities that could adapt to changing political circumstances while maintaining their essential Phoenician character, commercial acumen, maritime expertise, and openness to profitable innovation. Networks of trust. The Phoenician commercial empire functioned on trust networks that seem almost impossibly sophisticated for the ancient world. A merchant in Tyre could write a letter of credit that would be honoured in Carthage, Cadiz, or Cyprus. This required not just standardised writing and weights, but also a shared understanding of commercial law and dispute resolution that transcended political boundaries. The system worked through interconnected family businesses. A typical Phoenician trading house might have brothers, sons, and cousins stationed in a dozen different cities. These weren't mere employees, but partners with shared interest in the family's success. A young man would typically spend years apprenticing in different ports, learning local customs, languages, and market conditions. By the time he established his own branch of the business, he had personal connections throughout the Mediterranean. Marriage alliances reinforced commercial partnerships. The daughter of a purple merchant in Sidon might marry the son of a copper trader in Cyprus, creating bonds that went beyond mere contracts. Their children would inherit not just wealth but relationships, introduced from childhood to a network of cousins who were really business partners scattered across the known world. Information flowed through this network with surprising speed. A drought in Egypt that would affect grain prices, a new silver strike in Iberia, political instability in Assyria. Such news travelled along Phoenician trade routes faster than official diplomatic channels. Merchants made fortunes not just by moving goods, but by arbitraging information asymmetries, buying where news hadn't yet arrived and selling where it had. The Phoenicians developed sophisticated financial instruments that wouldn't be reinvented in Europe until the Italian Renaissance. They had maritime insurance, spreading risk among multiple investors so no single shipwreck could ruin a merchant house. They practiced commodity futures trading, agreeing to deliver purple cloth or metals at predetermined prices months in advance. They even had an early form of banking, with temple treasuries functioning as safe deposits and sources of commercial loans. Temple treasures, sacred commerce. The great temple of Melkart in Tyre served simultaneously as cathedral, bank, and commercial court. Its treasuries held not just ritual objects, but merchants' deposits, sealed contracts, and standardized weights that defined commercial honesty. The mixing of sacred and commercial wasn't corruption of religion, but recognition that prosperity and piety were inseparable in Phoenician thought. Priests served as notaries, witnessing contracts and storing copies in temple archives. When disputes arose, temple officials arbitrated, their decisions carrying divine authority that transcended secular law. A merchant who violated a temple-witnessed contract faced not just commercial penalties, but religious sanctions, exclusion from festivals, denial of burial rites, curses that would follow his family for generations. The temples also pioneered international banking. A merchant could deposit gold at the Temple of Melkart in Tyre and withdraw equivalent value from the Temple of Melkart in Cadiz, minus a small commission. This early banking network, secured by religious authority rather than governmental power, facilitated trade across vast distances without the physical movement of currency. The glass revolution. In the workshops of Sidon, artisans achieved what alchemists would spend centuries seeking: transformation of common sand into something precious. Phoenician glassmakers didn't invent glass, which had existed in Egypt and Mesopotamia for millennia, but they revolutionized its production, creating glass so clear it rivaled rock crystal, so thin it seemed to capture light itself. The breakthrough came through systematic experimentation with materials and techniques. Traditional glass was colored and opaque, its impurities creating greens and browns that, while beautiful, limited applications. Phoenician craftsmen discovered that adding manganese dioxide could neutralize the iron impurities that caused green coloration. They found that natron from specific sources produced clearer glass than plant ash. They learned to control furnace temperatures with precision that turned glassmaking from craft to science. The furnaces themselves represented significant engineering achievements, built of special refractory clays that could withstand temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. They featured multiple chambers, allowing different stages of production to occur simultaneously. The primary furnace melted the raw materials. Secondary chambers allowed controlled cooling and annealing that prevented the glass from shattering. Tertiary workshops enabled decoration and finishing, while the glass remained workable. Phoenician glassmakers pioneered techniques that seemed magical to contemporaries. They developed core forming, wrapping molten glass around clay cores to create hollow vessels, then dissolving the core with mild acid. They perfected glass blowing centuries before it supposedly appeared in the Roman period. Recent archaeological finds suggest Phoenician artisans were experimenting with blown glass by the 4th century BC. They created mosaic glass by fusing coloured rods into patterns, then drawing them out to create miniature designs visible only under magnification. The products ranged from utilitarian to extraordinary. Simple bottles and jars for perfumes and medicines, jewellery that captured sunlight in ways that gems couldn't match. Windows, a luxury almost unknown outside Phoenician buildings, that admitted light while excluding wind. Optical lenses that magnified text, making reading easier for aging eyes. Some scholars suggest the Phoenicians even created burning glasses, lenses that could focus sunlight to start fires, a technology usually credited to much later periods. The economic impact paralleled that of purple dye. A single shipment of fine glassware could purchase enough grain to feed a city through winter. Glass became a diplomatic tool. Gifts of Phoenician glass appear in royal tombs from Ireland to Iran. The technology itself became a carefully guarded secret. Glass-making families passed techniques from father to son under oaths of secrecy, and industrial espionage around glass technology was punishable by death. The glass industry also drove innovation in related fields. The need for consistent high temperatures led to advances in furnace design that benefited metallurgy. The chemistry of glassmaking contributed to understanding of other materials, ceramics, dyes, medicines. The precise temperature control required for quality glass production led to development of better measurement techniques, including early thermoscopes that detected temperature changes through expansion of liquids. Sunset over purple waters. The sun descends toward the western horizon, painting the harbour of Carthage in shades that no artist could truly capture. The water turns first gold, then orange, then finally that deep purple that gave these merchants their fortune and their identity. Ships rest at anchor, their sails furled, their holds full of treasures from half a world away. The city hums with the contentment of prosperity. Smoke rises from 10,000 cooking fires, carrying the scents of cuisines that blend influences from 3 continents. African grains cooked with Iberian olive oil and seasoned with Asian spices. Fish caught in Atlantic waters, served with wine from Greek vines planted in African soil. Every meal tells the story of connections, of boundaries crossed and barriers overcome. Children play in the streets. Their games a mixture of traditions. They chase hoops in the Greek manner, play board games with Egyptian rules, sing counting songs that preserve Phoenician number systems. Their skin shows the beautiful variety of the Mediterranean world, the olive tones of the Levant, the darker hues of Africa, the lighter shades of European ancestry, and every blend between. In the purple workshops, the day's final batch of dye reaches completion. The master dyer watches the colour develop, noting the exact moment when it achieves that perfect shade, not the purple of royalty, which is darker, almost black, but the purple of divinity, the colour that priests and prophets wear. This batch will travel to temples in Sicily, Greece, perhaps even to the mysterious lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where people worship gods whose names the Phoenicians are still learning. As darkness claims the sky, lamps are lit throughout the city, oil lamps of course, but also the marvel of glass lamps that multiply light, casting rainbow patterns on walls. The harbour lighthouse, one of the first in the world, begins its nightly vigil, its fire reflected by polished bronze mirrors that can be seen 20 miles out to sea. Ships still arriving can navigate safely home, guided by Phoenician innovation and Carthaginian ambition. When Assyria hungered, the storm that would eventually scatter the Phoenicians began not from the sea, but from the mountains of the east. The Assyrian Empire, that great devourer of nations, turned its hungry gaze toward the prosperous cities of the Lebanese coast in the 9th century BC. What followed was 3 centuries of a delicate, often deadly dance between Phoenician wealth and Assyrian power. The relationship started almost cordially. When Ashur-nasir-pal II arrived at the Phoenician cities around 875 BC, he came not as conqueror, but as tourist and customer. The Assyrian annals record his wonder at Phoenician prosperity, the purple garments, the carved ivory furniture, the silver and gold that seemed to flow like water through their markets. The Phoenician cities, reading the situation with their characteristic pragmatism, offered generous gifts that were clearly tribute by another name. Better to pay and preserve independence than resist and face destruction. For several generations, this arrangement held. The Phoenicians paid annual tribute: silver, gold, purple cloth, exotic woods, whatever the Assyrians demanded. In return, they maintained internal autonomy and, crucially, their maritime trade networks. The Assyrians, a land-based power with no naval tradition, needed Phoenician ships to project power into the Mediterranean. It was a symbiotic relationship, if an unequal one. But appetites grow with feeding, and each successive Assyrian ruler demanded more. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BC, transformed tribute into something approaching colonial administration. He appointed Assyrian supervisors in Phoenician cities, men who monitored trade and ensured that Assyria received its share, a share that grew larger each year. The Phoenicians found themselves funding the very military machine that threatened them. Some cities submitted completely. Byblos, once proud mother of cities, became little more than an Assyrian vassal, its kings requiring Assyrian approval before taking their thrones. Sidon tried to maintain a middle ground, paying tribute while secretly building alliances with Egypt and other powers that might counterbalance Assyrian dominance. But Tyre, protected by its island position and vast wealth, chose a different path, resistance calibrated just short of provoking total war. The tension reached breaking point under Shalmaneser V and his successor Sargon II. When Tyre withheld tribute in 725 BC, Assyria responded with a 5-year siege, but besieging an island city proved almost impossible for a land-based army. The Assyrians could control the mainland, denying Tyre access to its agricultural territories and fresh water sources. But they couldn't stop ships from bringing supplies from Cyprus, Egypt and Carthage. The siege ended in negotiated settlement. Tyre would pay tribute, but maintain independence, a face-saving compromise for both parties. The pattern repeated, with exhausting regularity. Sennacherib besieged Tyre again. Esarhaddon claimed to have conquered it, though the city clearly maintained independence, since his successor, Ashurbanipal, had to deal with Tyrian resistance yet again. Each siege weakened both parties, Assyria spending resources it needed elsewhere, Tyre losing population and wealth to emigration. The constant pressure accelerated Phoenician colonization. Every siege, every increase in tribute, every Assyrian atrocity sent waves of refugees westward. Skilled craftsmen, experienced merchants, and entire families fled to Carthage, to Sicily, to Iberia. What Assyria gained in tribute, it lost in the dispersal of Phoenician knowledge and commercial networks throughout the Mediterranean. The Assyrians were squeezing a sponge. The harder they pressed, the more the valuable contents spread beyond their reach. The siege of ancient Tyre. You wake to the sound that has defined your life for 3 years now. The rhythmic thud of Babylonian siege engines against the mainland defences. From your roof in the island city, you can see the smoke rising from what used to be the mainland suburbs of Tyre, now a blackened wasteland where Nebuchadnezzar's army camps. The year is 587 BC, though in truth, 1 year has blended into another in this endless siege. Your cistern is nearly empty again. The underwater springs that once supplied the island are failing. Whether from overuse or Babylonian sabotage, no one knows. Your daily water ration would barely fill a cooking pot. Your children have learned not to ask for more. They've also learned to identify edible seaweed, to catch rainwater in ceramic vessels, to make one dried fish last 3 days. The harbour still functions, though barely. Phoenician ships from Sidon and Byblos attempt to run the Babylonian blockade, but fewer arrive each month. Yesterday, a ship from Cyprus made it through, its hull scraped and scarred from ramming attempts. The crew spoke of Babylonian bribes, of other Phoenician cities urged to abandon Tyre to its fate. The grain they brought sold for its weight in silver, prices that would have sparked riots in normal times, but now seem simply the way things are. You work in the purple workshops, one of the few industries still functioning. Even under siege, Tyre produces the dye that defines its identity. The murex beds near the island are depleted, but diving teams still find enough snails to maintain production. Each small batch represents defiance. As long as Tyre makes purple, Tyre endures. The cloth you dye might be the last true Tyrian purple ever produced, a thought that fills you with both pride and infinite sadness. At night, you hear the priests conducting ceremonies in the temple of Melkart, praying for divine intervention that grows less likely each day. Some citizens have begun to speak of surrender, of negotiating terms with Nebuchadnezzar. Others advocate holding out. Carthage might send a fleet, Egypt might intervene, the Babylonians might exhaust themselves. But you know, in that deep place where truth lives, that this is the end of something irreplaceable. Your daughter asks you to tell her again about the time before, when ships filled the harbour like a forest of masts, when the markets overflowed with goods from land she'll never see, when purple cloth moved through the workshops like flowing water. You tell her, adding details you might be imagining, preserving in words what will soon exist nowhere else. She falls asleep to these stories of a Tyre that might never be again. Persian embraces. When Cyrus the Great's Persian Empire expanded westward in 539 BC, the Phoenician cities faced a familiar choice with an unfamiliar twist. The Persians came not as destroyers but as liberators, freeing Babylon and its subjects from Nebuchadnezzar's successors. For cities exhausted by Assyrian brutality and Babylonian sieges, Persian rule offered something almost forgotten: stability with dignity. The Persians proved masterful at managing diversity. Unlike the Assyrians, who demanded cultural submission along with tribute, the Persians allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religions, languages, and customs. The Phoenician cities found themselves part of the fifth satrapy, paying taxes that were actually lower than Assyrian tribute had been. More importantly, the Persians recognized and rewarded Phoenician expertise rather than merely exploiting it. Under Persian rule, the Phoenician cities experienced an unexpected renaissance. Sidon became the preeminent city, favored by Persian administrators for its reliability and strategic location. The Sidonians built palaces that blended Phoenician and Persian architectural styles, creating a distinctive aesthetic that archaeologists still marvel at. The famous Alexander sarcophagus, despite its name, was likely made for a Sidonian king of this period. Its exquisite carved scenes preserving the cultural fusion of the era. The Phoenician fleet became the backbone of Persian naval power. When Cambyses invaded Egypt, Phoenician ships transported his army. When Darius I launched his expedition against Greece, Phoenician vessels formed the core of his fleet. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, 300 Phoenician ships fought for Xerxes, more than any other contingent. Though the battle was lost, Greek sources acknowledge Phoenician sailors as the most skilled and dangerous opponents they faced. This military service came with privileges. Phoenician admirals commanded Persian fleets. Phoenician merchants received preferential trading rights throughout the vast Persian Empire, from India to Ethiopia. The Persian Royal Road, that marvel of ancient infrastructure, connected to Phoenician ports, creating trade routes that spanned continents. For the first time, Phoenician merchants could travel safely overland to Central Asia, exchanging purple cloth for silk, glass for spices. The relationship wasn't without tensions. The Phoenicians chafed at Persian demands for military service. especially when it meant fighting fellow maritime peoples like the Greeks. The revolt of Tennis, king of Sidon, in 351 BC, showed the limits of Persian tolerance. The city was brutally destroyed, 40,000 killed. Yet even after such violence, the Phoenicians and Persians needed each other too much for permanent estrangement. Sidon was rebuilt, the fleet reconstructed, trade resumed. Alexander's Causeway. The young Macedonian king stood on the mainland shore, staring at Tyre's island fortress, half a mile offshore. Alexander, who had never lost a battle, faced an enemy he couldn't reach. It was 332 BC, and the greatest military genius of antiquity was stumped by water. Old Asimilcus, king of Tyre, had thought himself clever. When Alexander demanded submission, Tyre offered neutrality. They would not oppose him, but neither would they allow him entry to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, Alexander's supposed ancestor. It was a calculated insult, suggesting Alexander wasn't worthy to enter the holy place. Now the king would learn the price of his calculation. Alexander ordered something unprecedented. He would build a causeway to the island, literally reshape geography to achieve victory. His engineers, skeptical at first, began planning. The strait was shallow near the mainland, but deepened approaching the island. The current was strong, the winds unpredictable. Previous besiegers had failed attempting far less ambitious projects. The work began with enthusiasm. Alexander himself carried the first basket of stones, setting an example his soldiers couldn't ignore. They demolished the ruins of mainland Tyre, using the rubble of centuries as building material. Day by day, the causeway crept forward, 50 feet, 100, 200. From the island walls, Tyrian defenders watched with amusement turning to concern. Surely the sea itself would stop this madness. But Alexander adapted to each challenge. When Tyrian ships attacked the construction crews, he built floating shields and protective towers. When divers tried to undermine the foundations, he posted swimmers with spears as guards. When fire ships threatened the wooden structures, he prepared defensive booms and water brigades. The causeway continued its inexorable advance. 300 feet, 500, 1,000. The siege lasted 7 months. When the causeway finally reached the island, and Macedonian siege engines could assault the walls directly, the end came quickly. Alexander's rage at the delay showed in his treatment of Tyre. 8,000 killed in the fighting, 2,000 crucified on the beach, 30,000 sold into slavery. The city that had resisted Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years fell to Alexander in 7 months. Victim, not of superior strategy, but of an enemy willing to move the earth itself. Carthage carries the torch. As the Phoenician homeland suffered under successive conquests, Carthage emerged as the true inheritor and transformer of Phoenician civilization. By the 3rd century BC, Carthage controlled an empire that dwarfed anything the homeland cities had achieved, dominating North Africa from Libya to Morocco, ruling much of Spain, controlling Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. This was no mere trading network, but a territorial empire backed by military force. Yet Carthage remained recognizably Phoenician in its essence. The Carthaginians called themselves Punics, Rome's version of Phoenicians, and maintained the customs, language, and gods of their ancestors. Tanit and Baal-Hamon, evolved versions of Astarte and Baal, received sacrifices in temples that followed Phoenician architectural principles. The Tophet, that controversial sacred precinct where children might have been sacrificed, scholars still debate whether literally or symbolically represented continuation of Canaanite religious practices that horrified but fascinated Greeks and Romans. Carthaginian innovations built on Phoenician foundations, their agricultural manuals, especially Mago's 28-book treatise, systematized farming knowledge accumulated over centuries. When Rome destroyed Carthage, they considered this agricultural encyclopedia valuable enough to translate into Latin the only Carthaginian text they preserved. The techniques described, crop rotation, grafting, irrigation, fertilization, revolutionized Mediterranean agriculture. The Carthaginian military evolved from Phoenician naval dominance to combined arms tactics that nearly conquered Rome. Hannibal Barca, Carthage's greatest general, represented this evolution perfectly. His father named him Hannibal, Grace of Baal, maintaining Phoenician religious traditions. His famous crossing of the Alps with elephants demonstrated Phoenician adaptability taken to extremes. His victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae showed strategic genius that military academies still study. Hannibal's army embodied Carthaginian cosmopolitanism, Numidian cavalry from Africa, Iberian swordsmen from Spain, Balearic slingers from the islands, Celtic warriors from Gaul, even Italian allies who defected from Rome, all united under Carthaginian command. This multi-ethnic force, held together by Carthaginian gold and Hannibal's charisma, came closer to destroying Rome than any other enemy in its history. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage represented more than political conflict. They were a clash between two visions of civilization. Rome offered citizenship and law, absorption into a universal state. Carthage offered commercial opportunity and cultural autonomy, a network of associated peoples rather than subjected provinces. For a century and a half, from 264 to 146 BC, these visions contested for Mediterranean dominance. When Carthage finally fell, the destruction was total. Rome didn't just defeat Carthage, it tried to erase it. The city was systematically demolished, its population enslaved or scattered. Legend claims the Romans sowed salt in the earth, ensuring nothing would grow. The Library of Carthage, which must have contained irreplaceable Phoenician texts, was dispersed or destroyed. An entire civilization's written memory vanished in flames. Yet Carthaginian influence persisted in unexpected ways. Saint Augustine, North Africa's great Christian theologian, was of Berber Punic ancestry and knew Punic as his first language. Punic continued to be spoken in North Africa until the Arab conquests. Carthaginian architectural techniques influenced Roman construction. Most remarkably, recent genetic studies show that Carthaginian bloodlines persist throughout the Mediterranean, especially in Tunisia, Malta, and Iberia, the purple merchants' descendants, hidden in the DNA of millions. The eternal alphabet. Every time you write your name, every text message you send, every book you read, you use the gift the Phoenicians gave humanity. The letters flow so naturally that their revolutionary nature becomes invisible. But pause and consider, the letter A began as an ox head, turned sideways and simplified over millennia. B was a house floor plan. G, a camel's hump. These everyday symbols carry 3,000-year-old memories of Lebanese harbours and purple-stained hands. The alphabet's journey from Phoenician ports to your screen represents perhaps the most successful technology transfer in human history. The Greeks took the Phoenician letters and added vowels, creating the first true alphabet, where every sound had a symbol. The Romans adapted the Greek version, spreading it throughout their empire. Medieval scribes developed lowercase letters for faster writing. The printing press standardized forms that had varied by region. The digital age reduced letters to patterns of electrons, but patterns that still echo their ancient origins. Consider how many scripts trace their lineage to those 22 Phoenician letters. Arabic and Hebrew directly descend from the Phoenician alphabet, maintaining the right to left writing direction. The Brahmic scripts of India and Southeast Asia, though heavily modified, show Phoenician influence through Aramaic intermediaries. Even scripts that seem completely different, like Mongolian or Manchu, often developed under the influence of alphabetic principles that Phoenicians pioneered. The democratization of literacy that the alphabet enabled changed more than just writing. When literacy was restricted to elite scribes, knowledge itself was centralized, controllable. The alphabet broke that monopoly. A merchant could teach his children to read without years of formal education. Ideas could spread person to person, mind to mind, without institutional intermediaries. The alphabet didn't just record language, it liberated thought, hidden in plain sight. Modern Lebanon's genetic landscape tells a story that history books nearly erased. When geneticists analyzed DNA from Lebanese populations in the early 21st century, they discovered something remarkable: direct continuity with ancient Phoenician samples recovered from archaeological sites. Despite millennia of conquests, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Arab, Ottoman, the Phoenician genetic signature persists in roughly 90% of Lebanese people. The genetic trail extends far beyond Lebanon. In Tunisia, site of ancient Carthage, Phoenician markers appear in a significant percentage of the population. Malta shows even stronger connections. The Maltese language, a unique Arabic dialect written in Latin script, contains a substrate of Phoenician words. Some Maltese fishermen still use terms for winds and sea conditions that would have been familiar to Phoenician sailors. Iberia reveals perhaps the most surprising persistence. In isolated communities along the Spanish and Portuguese coasts, genetic markers associated with Phoenician settlement appear at rates higher than surrounding populations. These aren't recent immigrants, but families who have lived in the same villages for centuries, unknowingly carrying the legacy of purple merchants who established trading posts there 3,000 years ago. The cultural DNA proves equally persistent. Lebanese merchants today dominate commercial networks spanning from West Africa to South America, displaying the same adaptability and commercial acumen as their ancestors. The Lebanese diaspora, estimated at 15 million compared to 4 million in Lebanon itself, created global trading networks that would seem familiar to ancient Phoenician merchants. From Sao Paulo to Lagos, from Detroit to Sydney, Lebanese businesses thrive through the same combination of family connections, commercial innovation, and cultural adaptability that characterized Phoenician expansion. Even place names preserve Phoenician memory. Cadiz, Spain, was Phoenician Gadir. Cartagena was Kart Hadasht, new city, just like Carthage itself. Malta probably derives from Maleth, Phoenician for refuge. The name Spain itself might come from Phoenician Shafan, meaning land of hyraxes, which they mistook for rabbits. Every time someone mentions these places, they unknowingly speak Phoenician words. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal Phoenician presence in unexpected places. In 2018, DNA analysis of bodies buried in Sardinia showed Phoenician ancestry in individuals previously thought to be indigenous. Phoenician inscriptions regularly emerge from construction sites around the Mediterranean. A new understanding develops. The Phoenicians didn't disappear, they blended so successfully with local populations that their distinct identity dissolved, while their genetic and cultural contributions persisted. The purple fades to memory. The last workshop lies silent now, its vats empty of the precious liquid that once defined an empire. The murex shells that built mountains along ancient shores have been ground to sand by 3,000 years of waves. Yet when the sunset light strikes the Mediterranean at just the right angle, the water still turns purple, as if remembering. In the ruins of Tyre, now a peninsula, thanks to Alexander's causeway turned permanent by accumulated silt, fishermen cast their nets where purple workshops once stood. They don't know that the concrete they walk on contains crushed murex shells, that every step they take crosses ground sanctified by the labour of their ancestors. The purple is gone, but its memory persists in the very stones. The cedars of Lebanon, Those mighty trees that built the ships that connected the ancient world survive in protected groves, barely 2% of their original range. Each remaining tree stands as a monument to what was and what was lost. Their wood still carries that distinctive scent, that natural resistance to decay that made Phoenician ships legendary. In their annual rings, some spanning 600 years, they hold memory of the time when Phoenician axes selected only the finest trees, when the mountain slopes rang with the sounds of shipbuilding. As night descends over the Mediterranean, the same stars that guided Phoenician navigators still wheel overhead. Polaris, the pole star they taught the Greeks to use, still points north. The constellation the Phoenicians called the Ship still sails across summer skies. The knowledge they discovered remains true. The stars are faithful guides for those who know how to read them. Somewhere tonight, in languages the Phoenicians couldn't have imagined, written in scripts they made possible, someone writes a love letter, a business contract, a poem. The purple merchants are gone, but every letter is their legacy, every written word their immortality. The story of the Phoenicians is ultimately a paradox resolved, a people who achieved immortality through disappearance. They built no pyramids, no Parthenons, no Colosseums. Their cities lie buried beneath modern ports or submerged under risen seas. Their literature, if it existed, vanished with the Library of Carthage, yet they transformed human civilization more profoundly than empires that left monuments of stone. Consider what they gave us: the alphabet that democratized knowledge, making literacy achievable for anyone willing to learn, 22 simple symbols. The commercial networks that proved trade could unite diverse peoples more effectively than conquest. The navigation techniques that transformed terrifying oceans into highways. The manufacturing innovations, transparent glass, purple dye, standardized weights, that established principles of quality and consistency still followed today. The diplomatic methods that showed how small states could survive and thrive among hostile empires. These gifts required no monuments because they became part of humanity's intellectual infrastructure, invisible because ubiquitous. Their greatest innovation might have been their response to constraint. Caught between the mountains and the sea, between hostile empires and uncertain waters, they chose connection over isolation, adaptation over rigid tradition, influence over domination. They discovered that power doesn't require territory if you control the networks that connect territories. They learned that cultural identity can survive political conquest if it flows through commerce, family, and practical knowledge rather than depending on state structures. In an age where digital networks matter more than physical territory, where small nations like Singapore or Switzerland wield influence far beyond their size through commercial and financial expertise, the Phoenician model seems remarkably prescient. From the harbours of ancient Tyre to the markets of Carthage, from the purple workshops of Sidon to the colonies scattered like stars across the Mediterranean darkness, we've traced the journeys of people who chose the uncertainty of horizons over the safety of home. They remind us that legacy isn't always measured in monuments or military victories. Sometimes the greatest achievement is to dissolve so completely into the fabric of civilization that forgetting you becomes impossible. Every letter you read carries their memory. Every ship that trades peacefully across borders follows routes they pioneered. Every moment that commerce brings former enemies together as partners echoes their ancient wisdom. May the tranquil flow of time carry you to peaceful rest.